702.
The Big Interview
With Bongani Bingwa.
Of course, we're reflecting on the year that has been as we mark, or as we prepare to mark, the first anniversary of going into lockdown. I've got a roundtable conversation. I'm joined by Cassey Chambers, who's the operations director at the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. We're also joined by Zamo Mbele, who's a clinical psychologist. By the way, we're streaming on our Facebook page. So if you want to see what they look like and you want to see our actual discussion, you can check it out on our Facebook page. We're on a Zoom call, and I'm going to ask Zamo and Cassey to unmute themselves because I can see that's what they need to do. So we've all had to deal with loss of incomes, perhaps even loss of loved ones. But one of the things perhaps we don't talk enough about has been the mental health crisis that has been brought on by lockdown as the major impact of the COVID-19 crisis. And the UN says although COVID-19 is in the first instance a physical health crisis, it also has the seeds of a major mental health crisis if action is not taken. I'll start with you, Cassey. You receive a lot of calls at SADAG from people who are reaching out, who need help. What has the last year been like? How have the volumes and the kinds of calls you are receiving changed?
Good morning, and thanks just for helping us to highlight this issue, and it's such an important time to do that. You know, SADAG has been monitoring really closely a number of calls from just before lockdown to the start of lockdown, and I still remember the first day of our hard lockdown was also the first day that they reported the first fatality in South Africa, and that seemed to have also triggered a lot of people. We saw our call volumes double overnight. You know, before we were at 600 calls per day, we then we're at over 1,200 calls per day. We're now getting over 1,400 calls per day. You know, we've been tracking the calls since last March to now the end of February, and we've received over 500,000 calls, so 500,000 calls to the SADAG helplines since lockdown, which is, I know we've heard the word a lot, but it's totally unprecedented. And I think so many people have been reaching out who have felt overwhelmed and anxious and just have really felt the impact of COVID-19 on their mental health. Interesting, from the beginning of lockdown, we had a lot of people who were more anxious, you know, trying to adjust and to manage and to cope. And as we went further into lockdown and the impact of the regulations, the guidelines, people losing jobs, worried about how to feed their families, what's going to happen next. So increased in depression and anxiety, and even calls around suicide and financial stress. It's had a huge impact on a lot of people. And I think more people can now relate to feeling in some way, shape or form, some anxiety, depression, stress that has been going on for a year.
Zamo Mbele is a clinical psychologist and is also part of this conversation. Zamo, good morning to you. I said earlier, this is a kind of double whammy, right? Because for many people who are grieving, for example, either loss of loved ones in the proper sense of grief, but also perhaps loss of incomes, loss of jobs. And at the same time, having fears and anxieties about their own health, about their own mortality.
Morning, Bongani, and to your listeners. Absolutely, I do think that it's quite important that we highlight the grief of the loss of loved ones and absolutely the loss of livelihoods, because that is something that we anticipate a lot of people are going to be presenting with. And that is something that we're dealing with quite actively, not just from the position of SADAG, the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, but also from the position of a collective of healthcare professionals who have come together to try and help all frontline healthcare workers. Is this idea that oftentimes when something happens, it's the grief that settles in 6 weeks, 6 months later that we're really beginning to deal with at this point. And it's quite helpful that you can have this conversation, because then hopefully a lot of people will begin to recognize some of those symptoms and presentations inside of themselves. And the first thing to say is, of course, it's incredibly normal and it's incredibly expected that if you lose something, you're going to experience the grief that comes with that loss, especially if it's been something very important. And I think that as a nation, as a society, potentially as the world, we are sitting amongst a lot of people, a lot of us are sitting with a lot of grief and loss, and we need to attend that. I want to add one brief note there, which is I think that even as a general population, the idea that we're going into an anniversary of the most strange thing must really alert us to the fact that we've all lost the ordinary normal that we knew before this.
Right.
So every single person must be experiencing some sort of strangeness, some sort of the uncanny of the loss of the ordinariness that you had, and perhaps the ordinariness that a lot of us would have projected into the future. And that is in and of itself a form of grief.
One of the challenging things, Zamo, has been this sense of isolation, not just in terms of people who may have symptoms and have to self-isolate, but being cut off, as you say, from what you are used to as a normal, cut off from your colleagues. People are finding it incredibly hard to work collaboratively in the old ways. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of pressure for those lucky enough to still be in employment, and they find themselves working a lot harder, a lot more than they ever used to. And that doesn't always necessarily mean people are productive. Talk to me about dealing with the new world of work and schooling as we've come to know it.
I mean, it's a massive conversation, and I'm going to have to really limit it to just putting the heads of argument there that we might have to come back to at a different point.
Yeah.
One of the things that you highlight is the complexity of having to now deal with school and home being in one environment. And I think that we do not have enough understanding and empathy, actually, as for a lot of parents, and we know statistically most of them being mothers, who have now had to double up on their job. They've had to continue being parents. They'll actually be twice the parent because it's a lot more time. They'll also now had to be an educator or a teacher or a tutor. And that hasn't been spoken to so that somebody can recognize the reason they're feeling, not just the distress and irritability, but also the absolute fatigue of having to do that. We can have a conversation about that. We can also speak about how when you delineate between work and home, it can be incredibly psychically important, not just in the transition from work to home, but also in being able to have the comforts of home when you come from work and so on and so forth. And even sometimes being able to escape the frustrations of home when you go to work, which is something that a lot of people need to do. And in fact, we all need to do it occasionally. But when that's been taken away, it's an all-in-one space and it's all one muddle. You can imagine then that it creates a degree of psychological distress and confusion too. We can speak about that all the way through to something else that you mentioned, which is this idea that, you know, to isolate, to be by yourself is oftentimes recognized as a psychiatric symptom. So when we're trying to understand depression or some sort of psychotic disorders and so on and so forth, one of the things that we look at is, has a person been spending more time by themselves? Have they been isolated? Now you can imagine that you take something which is oftentimes considered a symptom of distress and ask people to do that. It's not difficult then to see how the reverse can happen, how that practice of that symptom can actually bring about some sort of distress, or it can trigger distress that was already there in the beginning. So isolation is such a huge phenomena that we're having to deal with. And I hope you can see also potentially so dangerous in being able not only to bring about a lot of distress, but also actually mimic a lot of distress.
Cassey, let me bring you back into the conversation. We're talking now about isolation and this idea that a lot of people have been unable to escape the home environment, right? Whether that means going to school or going to their workplaces, but also what it means for a lot of people in abusive situations, in domestic violence situations. They've been locked up with the very perpetrators of crimes against them. What has been the impact on their state of mind in those spaces?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, we assume that being at home, everyone's safe, everyone has access. And for, you know, a privileged few of us, we do. We're safe at home. We have internet, we have TV and connection, and we're feeling safe. But for a lot of South Africans, that's not the case. Also, we're looking at a majority of people living with a number of people in the household, as you mentioned, we saw a huge increase in gender-based violence, and this was across all organizations that were working in the field. And I think that's also just really important to highlight the kinds of issues we had before lockdown and before COVID. Gender-based violence, abuse, trauma, these were all huge contributing factors, and they were exacerbated even further during lockdown. And I think those are the kinds of things that, as the months go on, that's the impact that we're going to be seeing. More and more people needing to access help, needing to find safety, and we just don't have enough resources to accommodate for everyone. We've had a lot of parents, women, mothers, a lot of people impacted by being abused, just not feeling safe, being exposed to things like substance abuse. And it just gives us the reality of what a lot of people are dealing with every single day.
Zamo, the difficulty, of course, with all of this is it's not done, right? We're marking, or we're gearing up to marking the first anniversary, but goodness knows how long this is going to be with us, and some aspect of it may never leave.
Absolutely, and the fact that we're marking the anniversary is such an important segue into conversation. You're not asking me this question. I'll take liberty at this point to say that the idea that we're marking an anniversary reminds us that we're creatures of custom and iteration and so on and so forth. We want to have something that allows us to know where we are. Now, one of the reasons we want to do that is because one of the reasons we want to do that is because we are of custom. And now you can understand why, when we cannot have funerals in the ways that we used to have them, it also really impacts on our ability to process the loss of that person, right? Because actually we need customs. So to return a little bit more to your question is that I think that when we mark anniversaries in this way, we're trying to look for some sort of predictability. We're trying to know. We're trying to manage the fact that there's no certainty. We're trying to manage the fact that as human beings, we really are oftentimes wanting to know by virtue of certainty, and that keeps us safe. And the idea that we do not know what is going to happen in the next couple of months with a third wave, with the vaccine, but also when this is going to end, is causing a great degree of distress because it's unknown. This amount of unknown is something that our psychologists are really battling to deal with on an individual scale, as well as a collective.
Part of the reason we're having this conversation, Cassey, as we wrap up your segment with us, is to obviously let people know that there are resources available. People who may not know where to begin if they're feeling all the things you and Zamo have been describing. From a SADAG point of view, what's the way to do? What's the way to go?
I think that's also just so important, to let people know that it's okay not to be okay. And it's about reaching out early to get that help, to get that support, and being pointed in the right direction. We're open 24 hours a day, and we can direct people to various resources around the country. And whether they're reaching out to SADAG or they're reaching out to resources in their area, their churches, their counseling centers, their mental health professionals, the most important thing is to get help, and to also know that mental health is just as serious as any other illness, and to get early intervention. So they could reach out to SADAG, and they can get all of our contact information as well as details and resources on our website at www.sadag.org, or you can also contact us on 0800 456 789. The most important thing, reach out, join a support group, get that. You mentioned that isolation and that loneliness. In a time of physical distancing, to find ways to socially connect with people and feel a little bit less alone in our new world where we cannot control. There's so many changes. Reach out for help. There is always help, and there is always hope.
Appreciate your time, both of you. Zamo Mbele, clinical psychologist, and Cassey Chambers from the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. It's okay to not be okay. Reach out. Tell someone. Don't wait until it's too late and you are completely overwhelmed. It's never too late.
702.
The Big Interview
With Bongani Bingwa.